Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a nice, big, gigantic 12-game Major League Baseball slate. This slate is large. We do have 3 games that have some weather concerns. The Mets game here is the most dangerous game when it comes to weather. It may be called early, and it's early in the slate, so that's a good sign at least. The other 2 games, Baltimore Philly game, is a little risky today, and the Pittsburgh Colorado game has some slight risk in it. But overall, I do think that at least the 2 games, the Colorado game and the Baltimore game, will play. And I think the Mets game is kind of up in the air at this point. But there's lots of ways you can go with this. So with so many games, you can ignore those teams if you really want to. I don't necessarily think that's a good idea, but you should. If the game is called, then it's definitely you won't need to use those guys at all. With that said, let's go ahead and get into the slate. So we have a pretty crazy one on here. Like a lot of teams, this is going to be a high scoring slate because there's some teams that they project really well, and then we have a bunch of teams that are kind of middle of the road, and a lot of middle of the road pitchers. So it's really going to be an interesting slate. I do think it's going to be high scoring from the bats perspective, but I do think there's some pitchers that have some real big upside here as well. So let's go ahead and get into it here. So let's look at the pitchers. The top 2 guys are Scuball and Sale. Now, Scuball has the best K rate on the slate. He's been over 18 fantasy points in 13 of 14 games this season. And he scored 22 fantasy points against Houston a couple weeks ago. He's got the best K rate on the slate. He has some nice upside as a result. However, he is fairly expensive, and he has one of the tougher matchups on the slate. So, I think he's going to have some potential here, but obviously it's not a perfect situation. But he's been so good all season long, he's hard to ignore from that perspective. But we'll look at Chris Sale for Atlanta against Tampa Bay. Now, I do think that this is a high risk, high reward situation. However, if you ignore the Oakland hiccup that he had, he's almost been as good as Scuball all season. He's also got a slightly better matchup, and he's probably been better from a strikeout perspective more recently, and have a higher ceiling than Scuball does. But they both have somewhat difficult matchups, and it's definitely going to be not the most perfect of situations. Now, Skubal did have a bad game against Oakland, or sorry, Sale had a bad game against Oakland 2 games ago, so do keep that in mind. But he does tend to limit the home runs at least so far the last 5 or 6 games, and he's really limited the earned runs overall. So I think he's a viable option as one of those 2 guys should probably be a core play in your P1 position. But you can kind of choose which one you like based on the situation. I'm probably leaning a little bit to Sale right now, but the fact that Scuball has a slightly better K rate definitely makes me think about him as well. But if you're doing GPPs, you can do a little bit of both. So some other guys to consider today: Freddie Peralta for Milwaukee, Hunter Green for Cincinnati. Both these in this game, both of these guys have some potential today. With Peralta having a good K rate for the matchup, though it's a little bit risky, a little bit safer than Hunter Green, who has a little bit better of a K rate, but has a tougher matchup against a team that has a lot of guys that definitely look solid today. So I think that that's a pretty interesting situation. A couple other players we could look at: Hunter Brown for Houston. He does have a favorable matchup against Detroit, but Detroit is it's kind of a sneaky team today. And while he's kind of high, he's got some upside. He's also got a lower ceiling than we'd like probably for this game. So I think he's a good GPP play, and he's got a good enough strikeout rate, which is could help him stay in the positive frame here. But he's a little bit risky on this one. I also like Heaney for uh, Texas. Now he's got a tough matchup here with Seattle, but he's been really boom or bust so far this season. And he has a little bit more upside today than some of the other guys because he has a decent enough K rate that's okay. But he doesn't give up a ton of earned runs, but he hasn't been getting a ton of K rates in some games. Today, I think he'll give up a couple earned runs, but also get 5 or 6 strikeouts. So I think that can keep him above being a terrible play on the slate. Kyle Bradish is also somewhat interesting today, though he's fairly expensive for Baltimore, and he's facing Philadelphia, which really does have some good bats in it. However, he's got a very high ceiling and a low floor, so he's definitely very close to being a boomer bust play today. Uh, the one boomer bust play I do have is Gosman for Texas. Now he's got a tough matchup against Cleveland. Cleveland doesn't like to strike out too much, and his strike K rate has been inconsistent, but he does look fairly good today for this particular matchup, assuming that the team that Cleveland's going to put together for the lineup is what at least we're projecting. And if that's the case, and he has a good enough K rate here that he can pay off, though he is fairly expensive for that boomer bust positioning. Three extreme options today are Gavin Stone, Matt Walden, and Luis Castillo. And then a Hail Mary play is Spencer Howard, who's a dirt cheap option. Uh, he hasn't pitched more than 4.2 innings so far this season, but if he can go five or so innings, he could definitely pay off here as he does have a decent enough strikeout rate if he can get that far in the game. But we'll have to see if he can get a little bit farther and not have too many pitches before he gets pulled. He's been ramping up game to game that he's played though, so hopefully he can get in the 80s and not give up any more than a couple earned runs to get some strikeouts to pay off at a $5,200 price point. Let's go ahead and get into our bats now. So we have a lot to choose from today, as like I said, we have a ton of games going. So I do have one core play and O'Neal Cruz for Pittsburgh, and I'll talk about him there. But there's a lot of good guys at shortstop today. But we got him in Colorado. he's one of the most powerful hitters right now in baseball. So he's definitely somebody you want to try to get a home run out of in that situation. Let's look at our catchers first, though. So we're going to start with Sean Murphy for Atlanta. Now, he has really struggled so far this season since he's been playing, but he does have some good metrics today, and he's got a favorable matchup against Liddell. He also has a good home run potential on the slate and has even multi-hit upside. Even though he's had one hit in the last five games, I do think he's somebody that's worth a look as he's nice and cheap. I also like William Contreras. William Contreras today for Milwaukee against Hunter Green. Now, he is a risky play, but he's been solid against Cincinnati this season. He's a little bit pricey, but he has good metrics today, though I don't think he's got the best of home run metrics, but he's got good upside on the slate, so he's definitely worth a look. A couple other guys to look up at Henry Davis for Pittsburgh is somebody that's going to have some potential today. Now, he's definitely a little bit risky as he's not really done a whole lot yet this season, but this matchup in Colorado definitely gives him some upside if he ends up drawing the start. I would also consider Salvador Perez today, but he is a little bit high risk, high reward, and also Gabriel Moreno, and maybe even Shea Langurlays from Oakland. So let's look at first base now. Excuse me here. So we're going to start here with Matt Olson. Now, Matt Olson has struggled throughout the season, but he's been better hitting lately, and the fantasy points really have not gone up a ton unless he gets a home run. So we do need him to hit a home run today. However, the metrics are really solid for that, and so I definitely think he's a viable play on the slate. I also like Christian Walker a lot for Arizona. He had a phenomenal game yesterday with 2 home runs. He's been hitting the ball very well the last few games, and I think he'll try to continue that here in a positive matchup against Flexen, and he has really good metrics here as well. A couple of plays that don't have the best of metrics or have tougher situations. Yandy Diaz is a great one-off for at a cheaper price against Chris Sale. Now, I do like Chris Sale a lot, but Yandy Diaz does have really fantastic metrics today, and so he's hard to ignore because he just looks really solid in this matchup. And then Bryce Harper also has some very interesting upside in this game against Baltimore. Even though Bradish does have some potential against this team, he definitely has the home run upside on the slate. Connor Joe is another guy you could consider at this position, and also Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Both of them look really solid for this slate. A cheap play at this position that you could go with are Gavin Sheets, and for the White Sox, he's a one-off here for them, but he has some nice upside today, and if he draws a start, he'll be somebody to consider as a cheap play to help you pay up at other positions or at pitcher. Ryan Mountcastle is another guy you could consider here, though. He's a little bit more contrarian, as well as Rowdy Tellez, so do keep that in mind. There's a lot of good guys at first base today, so there's a lot of good options. I do like Rowdy Tellez very rarely, but when I do, it tends to be a good thing here. I'll show him here real quick for Pittsburgh. This is a very favorable matchup for him. He's only had 2 home runs on the season, but he does have that potential in this matchup. So, looking at second base here, Ozzy Albies is the top overall play. Now, his metrics are not particularly great today, but he's been hitting the ball pretty good lately, and he just got to get going again. He started the season really well, and then he really struggled since he's been back from injury. But the last week or so, he's stringing hits together, and so as long as he can keep that up, then he's definitely going to be in play on the slate. However, he is expensive. Now, Ahmad Rosario does look like a rough situation today, but he does have good hitting metrics for this game, so he's definitely worth a look for a multi-hit potential. High risk, high reward play though, kind of a Hail Mary option on, to be honest. Here's a guy I really think is interesting today, G-Loff for Oakland. Now he is a Bimmer best play as well, but his home run upside today is off the chart. And I think Oakland's gonna score some runs on the slate. So and obviously they're gonna try to get home runs. And so he's one of the guys that I think has that opportunity. Jose Altuve is kind of a contrarian option at this position if you don't want to go with Albies, but still want to pay up at this one. But another guy you could look at is Nick Gonzalez uh, for Pittsburgh. Now, he doesn't have the best of metrics from a traditional sense, but uh, he's been hitting the ball very well. And so I think he has some good upside in this matchup being in Colorado. And he's been pretty solid so far this year with just the overall hitting aspect. So he's somebody that's worth a look. Keto Marte also has good metrics today, as does David Schneider. David Schneider is probably a sneaky play. His metrics are literally off the charts. I was gonna talk about him more at the outfield because I think he fits there better at this price point at least. But his metrics for a home run today are the best on the slate, so he's definitely a home run or best kind of option on this one. Looking at third base, we'll start here at the top with Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Now, Vlad was kind of a contrarian play at first base, but now that he can play at third base as well on DraftKings, he definitely has a lot of potential here. He has struggled the last few games though, but I do think that he's got top tier metrics for this slate, and he's priced pretty reasonably for this position. That's a little bit weaker than first bases, and so he definitely fits in there as well. Austin Riley is kind of a interesting play today. However, he is risky as he's really struggled lately, as have the Braves. But hopefully, if they can get going, he's probably going to be a guy that has some home run potential on this one. Another guy to consider today is Brian Hayes for Pittsburgh. Another guy that has good potential in Colorado. Not a huge home run hitter, but he does have some good potential on this slate, and he's got some upside in this matchup. Uh, Not a lot of home run upside though, just to make that clear. Um, Anybody else at this position? Oh, Royce Lewis, obviously, he's been fantastic lately. He didn't score enough fantasy points yesterday to pay off, but he definitely has that home run upside today again, and he's actually probably one of the top 5 guys in home run upside right now, so he's definitely worth a look. I would also look at Manny Machado, but he's kind of a high risk, high reward option today on the slate. So, and Ryan McMahon for Colorado as well, but he's a lot more risky on this one than we'd like. Looking at shortstops, so this position is kind of rough, but or it's kind of hard to just choose from, guys. But man, does O'Neill Cruz look just absolutely fantastic today from a metrics perspective. And he's got a favorable matchup against Colorado, who he's already dominated for 2 home runs in 3 games so far this season. So he looks like a solid play on the slate, and I'm very interested in utilizing him on this one here. Ahmad Rosario, who I mentioned at second base, could also fit in here as a cheap play, though I'm not really big on that. But I do like Ella De La Cruz here a little bit. He's kind of a contrarian play today, and he does need to hit a home run or get a couple stolen bases to pay off here. But I definitely think he's going to be motivated to do that today. And if we look at his stats for the season, unfortunately, being out on the road, he doesn't tend to get as many stolen bases, but he's actually got more home runs on average so far this season on the road. So he's definitely worth a look from that perspective. I also think Bo Bichette is a very interesting play today. He has been pretty interesting so far this season, as he's not really hit the home runs that we expected, but he is, scoring some fantasy points and a lot of games, and so he's definitely worth a look here as a relatively easy price play. And his metrics here today are about as good as they've been all season long. Lindor is also in play again. Now he's been inconsistent throughout the season, but with his home run potential, and he's been scoring better recently. In the few games he's looked really good the last week or so, he's paid off when we've looked at him, so he's definitely worth a look today. Ezekiel Tovar for Colorado, also a little bit overpriced, but is in play, as is Willie Adames for Milwaukee. So looking at outfielders, there's a lot of outfielders to choose from today. Obviously, in a huge slate, and outfield was one of the best positions yesterday. And there's just a lot of guys that have some good upside on the slate. For Tatis Jr., Randy A, Corbin Carroll, Brian Reynolds, um, Jack Sawinski, Marcel Ozuna, all just absolutely phenomenal options today. All fairly expensive. Connor Joe also has some decent metrics today, as does Kyle Schwarber and Andrew McCutchen. I do think that Pittsburgh's going to be a popular stack, but I also think Detroit has some interesting options with Riley Green there. But there's just a lot to choose from this position. From cheap guys, Gavin Sheets for the White Sox is a good one-off. I also think that George Springer looks okay today. So does Brandon Nemo. He looks okay. Max Kepler looks really good today, and so does Brent Rooker for Oakland. Even the outfield from Baltimore also has a lot of fantastic options like Santander, and then Brenton Doyle for Colorado is a relatively nicely priced play today, and Blade for Oakland also looks good. Jock Peterson from Arizona looks absolutely fantastic today, and Winsell Perez for Detroit looks solid today as well. There's just a lot of good options in the outfield today, and you can mix and match those. The way I'm going to be rostering my lineup today is I'm going to be trying to figure out who I want in the catcher to shortstop the most, and then fill in the pitchers and then the outfield based on price, just because there's so many good options. Minnesota's outfield with Larnach and Buxton, both viable. Davis Schneider for Toronto also as well, and Adam Duvall for Atlanta. I just think there's a ton of guys out there that are going to have some potential. Uh, the the rest of I think it's gonna be a tough slate to figure out the outfield just because there's so many options, and then there's a bunch of cheap guys like Justin Henry Malloy for Detroit. So when we're gonna be going through it, the stacks are really gonna make or break our outfielders, I think, today. So like when you're stacking particular teams, focus on using the outfield players when they look the best, because that way you can put in the good plays at the other positions that will help you win and get into the money in this. So let's look at our stacks today. So for the stacks here, Colorado, Pittsburgh, and Arizona come off as the top overall stacks. Obviously, a game in Colorado, and those guys seem to be inflated. And if you think this game is going to be high scoring, which it is the highest on the slate, though it's a little bit lower than some games on Pitts in Colorado, so you keep that in mind. I mean, these aren't the best teams that are going in this game, but McMahon, Stallings, Doyle are top three for Colorado, and then you can mix and match other guys from the team. For Pittsburgh, McCutchen, Gonzalez, Cruz, Reynolds, and either Joe or Hayes. I really do like the Pittsburgh stack today. I think they're in a fantastic situation. Arizona, Marte, Peterson, and Walker all have really good metrics. I didn't really like the back end of the lineup all that much, but McCarthy, Carroll, and Gurriel both all have some potential, but they're a little bit riskier today. You don't have to do five man line stacks on these teams. You can do three and then do another team's three or two, and kind of mix and match that way too, which helps. For Atlanta, Ozuna, Olson, Duvall, and then either Riley, Albies, and Harris. Man, Atlanta's really struggled lately, and it's so expensive to roster them, but they do look okay today. Minnesota, Lewis, Correa, Larnach, and Castro, and then you could add in Kepler if you wanted. It's a very interesting stack. I do like Minnesota a lot today, and I think they're going to have a really solid opportunity. The home runs are probably going to be a little bit more limited there outside of Lewis. For the Dodgers, Toronto, Milwaukee, San Diego, and San Francisco, these stacks all look really solid, but they're going to be a little bit more contrarian from the top overall ones. But the Dodgers are super expensive, but I added in Pages there because he does have some good home run upside today, and he had a home run yesterday as well. Looking at the Toronto stack, I mean, I really like that stack a lot. It's a little bit expensive, but I think it's a viable one today, though it's a little bit boomer busty. For Milwaukee, I think that they have got a lot of upside despite being against a decent pitcher. So it's an expensive stack, but it can definitely pay off and could win you a GPP if it really does well against a pitcher that's gonna have some usage. For San Diego, this stack, I don't love it, but I don't hate it. I think it's a fairly good hitting stack. I don't know this is going to be a super home run heavy stack, but it does look okay today. For San Francisco, this is a cheap stack, and it does project well. I think it's high risk, high reward, though, as nobody on San Francisco really looks all that awesome, but they also don't look terrible today. So then the next set of stacks, these are the stacks against pitchers that are going to have some opportunities for good games, but they have some guys on these teams that have some good potential as well. So the Angels, the Mets, the White Sox. These are teams that don't always really look that great fantasy wise, but they look pretty good today. I mean, they're decent plays today, and they're shorter stacks, some of these, so you could definitely play into those. Baltimore is an expensive stack, but it definitely has a lot of upside. It just has a high risk, high reward scenario, similar to Milwaukee that I just mentioned a few minutes ago. And then Seattle is a very cheap stack. And then you have some options there with pitching, with the catcher situation there. For Houston, Cleveland, Oakland, these teams, I mean, they project, or sorry, I should just say Houston, Cleveland, they both project decently, but they're in tougher situations, and they're also very pricey stacks, so they're not the most ideal ones. And so maybe not going a full 5 player stack on those two teams is the best strategy today. Looking at Oakland and Detroit, these and Kansas City too, these teams have really struggled lately, and but they have some home run pop with Oakland and Detroit and Kansas City, and so they're definitely worth a look from that perspective. But you could use just a couple guys from those teams and get some payoff there. For Philly and Tampa Bay, I mean, these stacks are expensive, and they're in really tough matchups, but they do have home run hitters, and they have some potential from that on that end. But they're kind of high risk, high reward. For Cincinnati and Texas, I mean, these two teams tend to have decent games occasionally. Texas has not been near as good as we'd hoped, and they're fairly expensive here, so you don't need to stack them fully, but they have some guys that have some upside today. Cincinnati, they got a couple guys that have some potential, but it's definitely a high risk, high reward type of stack. So, with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day, guys. Let me read your comments here in the thing. Yeah, sometimes bats are tough sometimes. In the free tournament, I'm in the main slate. Start 5:30 to 9:15 tonight. Can you help me get the top prize? Well, you just got to go contrarian to try to get first place. So like you got to do things that. So you want to figure out who the. You got to figure out who the core plays are, or sorry, I should say who the chalky plays are, and then you don't really want to use the chalk. You want to use the guys that are second, basically, and hope that those guys can pay off. Because in order to win a things like that, you got to be very precise on very you got to get guys that are low owned or they score a ton of points. So like O'Neal Cruz would be a guy that you would want to throw in just because of pure. If I'm not sure if he's on the slate you're mentioning here, but um, he's kind of the most core play, and if he can score a couple home runs, then he can definitely help you there. But you got to be contrarian on all the other positions because you don't want to you want your lineup to be different than most everybody else, and so it's hard to win those. I mean, it's really hard because I mean, you just baseball is a very fickle sport, and it's very hard to get a lot of home run guys in the same lineup, or get a bunch of multi-hit guys, or get guys that get stolen bases. But one thing you can do is you can look for guys that have home run potential today, and also look for guys that have the a good stolen base upside, like Ella De La Cruz, for instance. But you need cheap guys too, and so you're gonna have to take some chances on some sub $3,000 plays probably to help pay for pitching and things like that. Because while pitching's pretty expensive today for the upside that it has, and so it's definitely um, not the best slate from a pitching perspective for that, because there's going to be some high risk, high reward. And then if you got that Pittsburgh Colorado game, that's just a Hail Mary game. But you have some cheap plays in that game that you could utilize, like Henry Davis for Pittsburgh at catcher. But you also have guys from the White Sox that you could utilize that could help you today, like Nicky Lopez or Andrew Benintendi, that are cheap. Also, Detroit with Henry Malloy and McKinstry and Urshela have some upside, which and they're nice and cheap today, and they've got not the hardest matchup, and that's a good contrarian way to go. But there's a lot of you have to be very contrarian when you're trying to win a takedown there because it's just can be hard to do. So like if we look at Detroit, Green, Urshela, and Berling all look pretty good. So does Malloy and Rogers. But you could also look at McKinstry there, and you could go with the Detroit stack and try to win that way, as I think that's got the most, from a perspective of trying to get a good set of contrarian plays. Going with a team that has some upside but is in a not perfect situation is the way you're going to be contrarian to try to win. With that said, guys, thank you for